Ukraine's capitulation? Russia and the US have agreed on the Kremlin's peace plan proposed by Putin.
This includes relinquishing part of the territory, halving the size of the armed forces, and restricting the use of certain types of weapons.
Donbas to Russia, money to Ukraine, American-style Donbas lease. This refers to a money for land scheme, where Moscow would have to pay for the occupied region. A truce is near. The Istanbul process is returning.
It would be useful to resume the Istanbul process in a broader format in order to comprehensively address the issues that have become more acute.
Moscow has its own negotiation plan. The absurdity is only getting stronger.
Moscow is open to negotiations. The pause that occurred actually happened because the Kiev regime was unwilling to continue the dialogue.
The Kremlin's Koshchei wants eternal power over Russia.
I suppose you could even stretch it to 150 years. But first of all, it will never be enough, just like with money.
The mysterious disappearance of Lavrov on his deathbed.
The head of the foreign ministry suffered a hypertensive crisis, after which he was in the Central Clinical Hospital and is now undergoing rehabilitation.
Right now, friends, we're going to discuss all the above-mentioned topics in a broader context. Among other things, we'll talk about the much-discussed Trump plan with its 28 points. 28 points for surrendering Ukraine, as many people are saying. We'll talk about whether there will be a meeting between Zelenskyy and Putin. And in general, what will come out of Zelensky's meeting with the American generals, which is happening right now behind closed doors. And we'll talk about how Putin is promising Russians they'll live to be 150 years old. Does the Kremlin dictator himself believe this? We'll cover this story, and then I'll be waiting for you in the studio for discussion.
Peace is closer than ever. The White House expects that the framework agreement to end the war between Russia and Ukraine will be reached by all parties by the end of the month and under the most favorable conditions, even as early as this week, according to Politico. However, it is quite possible that such a peace will not satisfy either Ukraine or Europe and will only give Russia time to prepare for the next attack. According to Axios, citing anonymous sources, while Ukraine was rocked by a corruption scandal, so-called Mingachgate, and a political crisis was unfolding, the US and Russia prepared their own peace plan. And they did so in secret, not only from Zelensky's administration, but also from their Western partners.
According to Axios sources, the 28 points of the plan can be divided into 4 categories. Peace in Ukraine, security guarantees, security paths in Europe, and the future of US relations with Russia and Ukraine. It is still unknown how the plan addresses contentious issues, such as control over territories in eastern Ukraine, where Russian troops are gradually advancing but still control much less land than the Kremlin demands.
According to Axios, behind these nearly 30 points are meetings between Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Kremlin Envoy Kirill Dmitriev. Allegedly, the two of them held intensive negotiations in Miami at the end of October. Dmitriev himself confirmed this information to journalists and stated that in Moscow they feel that the Russian position has truly been heard.
Dmitriev told Axios that the main idea is to take the principles that Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed upon during their meeting in Alaska in August and to break down proposals that would resolve the conflict in Ukraine, as well as allow for the restoration of US-Russia relations and address Russia's security concerns. It's actually a much broader framework that essentially raises the question of how to finally ensure lasting security for Europe, not just Ukraine, he said.
What the Russians and the Americans agreed upon remains a mystery. But both before and after the Putin-Trump meeting in Alaska, the Kremlin made no secret of its ambitions. There aren't even any differences from the original plan. In Moscow, they still want, and Lavrov has stated this, to control the government, the church, the media, and the status of the Russian language as a state language, as well as to achieve demilitarization and a non-aligned status.
There are 28 points grouped into 4 categories, which are hidden behind rather favorable-sounding names, such as guarantees of security and stability in Europe. But what can Dmitriev and Witkoff develop? I think this is a rhetorical question. Perhaps indeed the US believes that they are close to some kind of agreement. But it is important for us to understand that these agreements, as always, are being negotiated without Ukraine, and as always, they are trying to present Ukraine with a fait accompli.
Politico, Reuters reports that an American delegation has secretly arrived in Ukraine. Trump sent Army Secretary Dan Driscoll, a friend of Vice President J.D. Vance's from Yale Law School, who became a key figure in the Pentagon, to Kiev. Allegedly, he will not only be interested in Ukrainian developments in the field of drones, but will also promote Trump's desire to announce the end of what is already his 9th war as soon as possible. A meeting between Volodymyr Zelenskyy and the Americans is scheduled to take place after his return to Ukraine. On Wednesday, the president visited Ankara, where he planned to meet with Witkoff, but Witkoff cancelled his trip to Turkey. The plan of Witkoff and Dmitriev, which they are trying to persuade the Ukrainians to accept, is being actively discussed against the backdrop of a political crisis in Kyiv itself, with demands for ministers' resignations and the formation of a new government. Amid the potential redistribution of influence and portfolios, Russia once again barbarically attacked Ukrainian cities. In Ternopil alone, the number of dead has approached 30, and the number of injured is nearly 100.
Alexei Borichenko, candidate of political sciences, is joining our broadcast. Alexei, we're glad to see you. Hello?
Greetings to you.
Likewise.
And greetings to all our esteemed viewers.
Let's start with the hottest topic. These are the so-called 28 points from the Trump administration, which many are calling the 28 points of Ukraine's capitulation. What do you think in general? Does such a document even exist? Absolutely all American media outlets have written about it. And it all started when Steve Witkoff supposedly posted something about it by accident on his social network X. So basically, there are these 28 points, and each one talks about reducing Ukrainian sovereignty, downsizing the army, giving up territories, and so on and so forth. What does all of this mean?
Well, first of all, let's talk about the information surrounding these 28 points. Yes, because right now, we actually don't have the draft of the document itself, meaning the one that, as far as we understand, has already been agreed upon between the Americans and the Russians. That's the situation. All we see, let's say, is a lot of white noise. And here, it's very important to approach everything as calmly and professionally as possible. And here, we need to start from the issues that are sensitive for us, of course, like what's being written now. Again, the transfer of Donbass, which the Russians are insisting on. No NATO, no Western contingents, and again, issues of language, the Russian Orthodox Church, and so on, and so on. Here, you need to consciously put your emotions on pause for a moment and take a careful look at what's actually happening. Where did these 28 points originate, and what specific goals are both the Russians and the Americans pursuing by agreeing on this particular draft, which, of course, would significantly change the paradigm of the issue of negotiations, if, of course, it turns out to be realistic. So, actually, I suggest we start with the basics now, laying a solid foundation for our understanding before we proceed. Where did these 28 points come from? And why did this happen? Well, then it will be significantly easier for us to answer more, sensitive questions and discuss their content. So let's be as concise as possible. So where did this whole initiative actually originate from? The one that was coordinated not through the highest diplomatic channels between Moscow and Washington. Essentially, it was Dmitriev and the investment manager, yes, Putin's own advisor, and O'Brien, the special representative, in fact, of the President of the United States of America. Well, he's quite a trusted figure, as we know very well. He has flown to Moscow more than once and really has good communication with the Russian negotiating team. The same American media outlet you mentioned earlier wrote that in the city of Miami, they spent a total of 3 days with O'Brien, carefully drafting this future peace plan. So why did this happen? And this happened because Russia, to be perfectly honest, how should I put it? They had a screw up. Let's call things by their proper names. It was a small diplomatic disaster when a previously agreed meeting in Budapest between Trump and Putin fell through after the preparatory groups had already made contact at the level of Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, and Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. And it was then when the Americans finally realized that Putin had no intention of showing any constructiveness in the negotiation process, and that he wasn't going to stop the war along the line of demarcation, even after the potential meeting in Budapest, that the Americans changed their position and truly shifted to putting pressure on Russia through force, implementing a sanctions package against Russian energy, and in particular, sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil. Moreover, they were further motivated by the fact that now was the time to put pressure on the Russian Federation to achieve Trump's political goals, as well as by the meeting in South Korea. This is often forgotten, but it is a very important element in this chain. Well, because essentially Xi Jinping and Trump resolved all their immediate contentious issues and postponed them until 2026, which of course gave Trump a free hand. And now in negotiations with Putin, the stakes are not as high for Trump as they were before. At least that's how he sees it now. Because remember, even earlier, Trump himself stated that he wanted to possibly pull Russia away from China. But now everyone in Washington has realized that Moscow's dependence on Beijing is enormous, and the entire strategy that Trump was implementing almost throughout all of 2025 turned out to be mistaken, turned out to be a failure. And simply with red carpets and long conversations, it's impossible to convince Putin to accept Trump's terms for ending the Russia-Ukraine war. That's why it's necessary to move on to a completely different plan. Does this constitute a catastrophe for the Russian Federation? No, at this point, it's not a catastrophe, but these are extremely painful sanctions that by 2026 or 2027 could restrict, let's say, the majority of oil revenues flowing into the Russian budget. Moreover, it's not even just about the simple fact that the Russian Federation actually gets about 30% of its total budget revenue from energy exports. The biggest problem for the Russians isn't even that, but rather that if they're squeezed out of the global energy markets by European and American sanctions, they simply won't be able to get back in later. And by the way, the recent contact between the Saudis, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, when Saudi Arabia received the most advanced F-35s, the same as Israel has, and when they were granted a rather serious status equal to that of Israel, Qatar, and Kuwait as a major non-NATO ally of the United States, considering that this is a key OPEC plus country, this is a very bad signal for Moscow. And now in Moscow, they've started to seriously think about what to do, because they can keep putting on stone faces and talking about sanctions endlessly. They've been fighting them for a long time, and they don't have any truly critical effect. But in reality, what the Americans and Europeans have now achieved in terms of sanctions pressure, primarily on Russian oil, is significant. It could really lead to, well, a catastrophe for the entire industry, which would mean a catastrophe for the Russian Federation's economy. The potential consequences are political as well, including the possible collapse of the country, and of course, even the physical elimination of Putin himself by those around him. Well, does Putin understand this? Yes, of course. That's why Dmitriev was sent and everything that's happening now. Well, I think, first of all, Dmitriev wasn't alone. He works for, there's a whole large analytical group in Russia working on forming a new framework, a new paradigm. So Dmitriev is just, well, like the tip of the spear, so to speak, right? He's the main negotiator, Putin's trusted envoy. Yes, so they tried to change the framework, understanding that Putin would not accept Trump's ultimatum under any circumstances, that Putin is not ready to stop the war, Putin is not ready to stop at the line of demarcation, and that Putin is, let's say, at this point, ready to accept terms of capitulation for Ukraine. But as for accepting Trump's ultimatums, no, he is not ready. So what then? So most likely the Russians tried to basically step out of the previous negotiation paradigm, because the peace plan that was presented in Istanbul at the third meeting, well, essentially that's where the whole Istanbul process ended. When we saw Ukraine's peace plan agreed upon with European partners and the Americans, which is absolutely fair, yes. It includes the restoration of Ukraine, an international tribunal, and so on and so forth. Our esteemed viewers can look up its full contents. And at the same time, the Russians presented their own plan, essentially a capitulation plan for Ukraine. And these plans had absolutely no common ground, not a single point of contact between them. So it became clear to everyone that the Istanbul negotiation track had reached a dead end, and without a meeting at the leaders' level, it simply couldn't be unblocked. And that's why, well, sanctions pressure on the Russian Federation began, with the aim of forcing them through pressure to a more reasonable negotiating stance. So what have the Russians come up with now? Well, I don't really know. Of course, I don't have complete information to confirm my words. These are, if you will, my analytical conclusions, but still, I'll share them on our broadcast. I think the Russians proposed a general and comprehensive framework that was later utilized by President Trump to help achieve peace in the Middle East. This is significant because just recently, that peace plan for the Gaza Strip was officially adopted by the United Nations Security Council. So as an official peace plan, it's no longer just, well, an initiative by Trump and the guarantor countries. Now all the members of the Security Council are fully involved in this process. And its implementation will be ensured not only by, let's say, Trump's authority or the United States itself, but now the United Nations will also be directly interested in it, since there is a corresponding Security Council resolution. So, as far as I can preliminarily judge, the Russians want to follow roughly the same path. In other words, they want to elevate these 28 points, these 4 blocks that we all already know very well, to a higher level than just the issue of resolving the Russia-Ukraine war. So yes, as we discussed, to end active hostilities along the line of contact and then move on to the political part of the process, they just want to cross out everything that was discussed earlier. Because, well, these negotiations have reached a dead end, primarily for the Russian Federation itself, and are already leading to negative consequences for it. And now they're offering the states a completely different, interesting, tempting proposition. They say, look, let's not focus on resolving the Russia-Ukraine war track, but instead make it part of a much broader context, ensuring security throughout all of Europe. By the way, do you recall Erdogan's remarks, which he made following his meeting with our president, when he specifically mentioned that Istanbul is now fully prepared and ready to host the negotiations in a much broader and more inclusive format than before? So, most likely Erdogan meant not only that negotiations in Istanbul concern, for example, the return of prisoners of war, but also that Istanbul is ready to become a platform for new talks on the general contours of security across the entire European continent. And it is precisely this idea that the Russians are now trying to sell to Trump and to the United States of America. But by the way, just a small remark, I think the states don't fully believe in its realism because, again, we can see that the contact at the level of Witkoff and, let's say, an additional delegation, this is not a statement from Trump himself. He is still being very cautious. Or, for example, Mark Rubio, the Secretary of State, who is responsible for the diplomatic track for this process. This negotiation process, most likely, is not actually a real negotiation as of today, especially regarding these 28 points. It seems to me that on the part of the United States, this is really a kind of probing whether the proposed framework can actually find some understanding in Brussels, but above all, whether it can find any understanding in Kyiv itself. And, you know, I'm even ready to make a prediction that the Russians might agree to remove these added points about the Russian language, about the RTC, about the transfer of Donbass, and so on and so forth. In other words, they will be ready to remove the contentious points from the overall document. They are using the Gromyko strategy. If you remember, they state the maximum demands, but in order to reach some kind of realistic result, and essentially, what's the idea? The idea is to achieve a completely new normal negotiation track with the President of the United States, Trump, not just about the Russia-Ukraine war, but so that the United States and the Russian Federation agree on the contours of security, not for Ukraine, but for all of Europe. So when one of the blocks there talks about security guarantees, we're used to reading it as security guarantees for Ukraine, but most likely it's actually about security guarantees for all of Europe.
Thank you so much. Alexei Boryschenko, as always, emotional and factual. A candidate of political sciences, was on air on Ukraine Today. Alexei, all the best. Thank you.
All the best.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.